My husband laughed when I got laid off, saying, "Maybe you'll finally learn to cook better." His mother nodded in agreement. I packed my office in silence. 2 weeks later he came home early. I was in the kitchen, with his CEO, and a special guest. They'd been there for hours, discussing something he didn't know about. I lost my job on a Tuesday. My husband laughed when I told him. Not a sympathetic chuckle. Not a nervous reaction to bad news. Real laughter. The kind that comes from genuine amusement, the kind that makes your shoulders shake. "Maybe now you'll finally have time to learn how to cook a decent meal," Derek said, taking another sip of his beer without even muting the basketball game. His mother nodded from the armchair. "I've been saying for years that Emily needs to focus more on home." I stood there holding a cardboard box with 12 years of my career packed inside, and they sat there judging me like I just failed some test I didn't know I was taking. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that I hadn't been fired at all. I'd orchestrated my own layoff. For 6 months, I'd been secretly building a federal case against Meridian Financial, documenting fraud that would send executives to prison. My CEO's signature was on falsified reports. Pension funds had been embezzled. Offshore accounts hid millions in stolen money. And my husband, his company was right in the middle of it. His signature was on dozens of documents that would soon become evidence. But as I stood there listening to him mock me, watching his mother agree that I'd failed, I realized something. They had no idea who I actually was. And in 2 weeks, when the FBI showed up at our dining room table, they were going to find out. The meeting that morning had been perfectly staged. Margaret Chin, the HR director, sat across from me in the sterile conference room on the 14th floor. She'd rehearsed her lines: restructuring, market volatility, difficult decisions. Her eye contact was practiced. 3 seconds of connection, then a glance at the papers, then back up. Just human enough to avoid a lawsuit. My cardboard box sat beside my chair, already packed by security before I arrived. I could see the edge of my framed CPA certification, the coffee mug my niece had painted for me in 3rd grade, a photograph from the company retreat in Vermont where everyone smiled and pretended we were colleagues instead of strangers collecting paychecks. Margaret slid the severance papers across the table. I picked up the pen and signed in 3 places without reading a single word, because I'd written most of those terms myself 3 weeks ago. "We wish you the best, Emily," Margaret said, standing to shake my hand. Her palm was cool and dry. Professional. She'd done this twice already this week. I picked up my box and walked out through the bullpen of cubicles. Nobody looked at me. Corporate survival instinct. Don't make eye contact with the wounded. Might be contagious. The elevator ride down felt endless. I watched the numbers descend: 14, 13, 12. My reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman in a gray blazer holding a cardboard box. I looked defeated. Exactly what I needed to look like. Because this wasn't a termination. This was strategic positioning. 6 months ago, I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to find. Carol Simmons, a woman I'd worked with for 6 years, called me 3 weeks after she retired. She was crying. Her pension had been reduced by 70%, and the statements didn't make sense. The numbers didn't add up. So I looked into it. I stayed late one Friday, pulled files I wasn't authorized to access, traced transactions through accounts that shouldn't have existed. What I found made my hands shake. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Falsified audit reports with Richard Brennan's signature. Phantom transactions designed to inflate quarterly earnings. Embezzled pension funds. Not just Carol's but 234 employees whose retirement accounts had been systematically drained. I started documenting everything. I photographed records in empty conference rooms after everyone went home. I recorded conversations on my phone during meetings where executives joked about creative accounting. I copied files to encrypted drives hidden in my gym bag. For 6 months I built a federal case while pretending everything was normal. I needed to get out before the investigation went public. If I was still employed when the fraud was exposed, defense attorneys would paint me as complicit. They'd argue I knew and did nothing. They'd say I was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. So I orchestrated my own exit. I negotiated terms that protected me legally, secured my severance, and positioned me as a victim of corporate downsizing rather than the whistleblower who saw too much. Margaret Chin had no idea. He thought I was just another budget cut. Now I was driving home to tell my husband I'd lost my job, and I already knew exactly how he'd react. The house looked the same as it had that morning. A modest 3-bedroom colonial with blue shutters and a lawn Derek never mowed. I sat in the driveway for a moment, preparing myself. Inside, Derek was exactly where I expected. Sprawled on the leather couch, beer in hand, remote in the other, watching basketball with the volume loud enough to rattle the windows. His mother Janet sat in the armchair by the window, knitting something purple, reading glasses perched on her nose. I set the cardboard box on the dining room table. The sound made Derek glance over, but he didn't mute the television. "Lost my job today," I said. Factual. And that's when he laughed. Janet set down her knitting needles and nodded slowly. You can't do everything, Emily. Clearly the career thing wasn't working out. I stood there letting their words wash over me. I didn't argue. 7 years of marriage had taught me that defending myself only gave Derek more ammunition. He'd twist my words, find weakness in my tone, use my frustration against me. So I picked up my box and walked to the kitchen. I set it on the counter beside the sink and stared out the window at the overgrown backyard. Derek's laughter still echoed in my head. I opened the cabinet and pulled out a dish towel, folding it carefully, smoothing the creases. Then I started planning dinner. Over the next 2 weeks, I maintained a careful routine. I woke early, made coffee, opened my laptop at the kitchen table and pretended to search for jobs. Derek left for Henderson Logistics by 7:30. Janet usually went to her book club at the community center or visited friends. I used those hours to meet with Special Agent Michelle Torres from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We sat in coffee shops 30 miles from my neighborhood, reviewing documents, building timelines, connecting transactions to specific executives. Michelle was in her late 40s with short dark hair and the kind of steady presence that made people tell her the truth. She explained what would happen next. Interviews, depositions, eventually a grand jury. My testimony would be the foundation of the entire prosecution. At home I cooked dinner every night. Simple meals that Derek criticized anyway. Chicken's dry again, he'd say, cutting into the breast with exaggerated difficulty. Janet would offer suggestions about seasoning and temperature, as if I hadn't been cooking for myself since I was 19. I nodded and smiled and said nothing. Meanwhile, I'd been quietly documenting Derek's connection to the fraud. Henderson Logistics handled all shipping and warehouse operations for Meridian Financial. Derek's signature appeared on dozens of manifests for deliveries that never happened. Phantom services billed to inflate expenses and hide embezzled funds. He wasn't a mastermind, but he was complicit through sheer negligence. One evening while Derek was at a work event, I found Janet in the home office. She was sitting at the desk with papers spread out, and she gathered them quickly when I walked in. Just looking for a pen, she said. Her smile was too tight. But I'd seen the letterhead. Meridian Financial. After she went to bed, I searched the office. It took 20 minutes to find her retirement portfolio. $400,000. Every penny invested in Meridian Financial stock. That's when everything clicked into place. 7 years ago, Janet had pushed Derek and me together at a church function. She'd insisted we were perfect for each other despite having almost nothing in common. She'd hosted the engagement party, paid for part of the wedding. I'd thought it was maternal affection. It wasn't. Janet wanted inside information. For 7 years she'd been using our dinner conversations, my casual mentions of quarterly earnings, upcoming mergers, management changes, to make investment decisions. She treated me like an incompetent housewife who couldn't cook a decent meal, but she'd hung on every word I said about my job. When Meridian collapsed, Janet would lose everything. I stood in the home office holding her portfolio statement, and something cold settled in my chest. I'd been underestimated by these people for years. Treated like an accessory to Derek's life. Valued only for what I could provide them. They thought I was small. Insignificant. Easily dismissed. They had no idea who I actually was. And in a few days, when Special Agent Torres sat at our dining room table with evidence spread everywhere, they were going to learn the truth. This wasn't just about exposing corporate fraud anymore. This was about dismantling every assumption that made Derek and Janet think they could diminish me without consequences. 2 weeks passed like clockwork. I woke early. Made coffee. Opened my laptop at the kitchen table and pretended to search for jobs. Derek left for Henderson Logistics at 7:30, briefcase in hand, barely looking at me. Janet went to her book club or visited friends, always gone by 9. And I met with Michelle Torres. We sat in coffee shops far from anyone who might recognize me, building the case document by document. Michelle explained timelines, legal procedures, what to expect during depositions. She was patient and thorough, never rushing, never dismissing my questions. At home I cooked dinner every night. Derek criticized every meal. Janet offered suggestions. I smiled and nodded and said nothing. On Thursday of the second week, Derek came home early. I was at the dining room table when I heard his car in the driveway. It was 2:15 in the afternoon. He wasn't supposed to be home for another 4 hours. I didn't move. I didn't hide anything. I simply closed the folder in front of me and waited. The front door opened. Derek's footsteps moved through the entryway, hesitated in the living room, then continued toward the dining room where voices were clearly audible. He appeared in the doorway and stopped. Michelle Torres sat to my right, her FBI badge clipped to her belt, visible and official. Across from me sat Richard Brennan, CEO of Meridian Financial. He looked nothing like the confident executive from the company website. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His face was pale and unshaven. His hands shook slightly as they rested on the table. Documents covered every available surface. Shipping manifests, audit reports, bank statements, coffee cups and empty sandwich plates suggested we'd been here for hours. As we had been. Derek, I said calmly. You're home early. He stared at me, then at Michelle, then at Richard Brennan. His mouth opened but no sound came out. Finally he managed, I had a dentist appointment. No you didn't, I said. It wasn't a question. His face flushed. He'd been caught in a lie so small it was almost embarrassing. He'd come home to check on me, to see what I was doing with all my free time, probably hoping to find me watching television so he could make another comment about wasted days. Instead he'd found this. Michelle stood, extending her hand. Mr. Walker. I'm Special Agent Michelle Torres, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We're going to need to speak with you as well. Derek shook her hand automatically, his eyes still scanning the documents on the table. I watched him recognize his own signature on several manifests visible from where he stood. Sit down, I said, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. He sat. Michelle returned to her seat and opened a folder. She pulled out a document and slid it across the table toward Derek. Henderson Logistics has been handling shipping and warehousing operations for Meridian Financial for approximately 3 years. Is that correct? Derek nodded slowly. And you've been signing off on delivery confirmations and manifest approvals during that time? Another nod. Michelle pulled out 3 more documents, laying them side by side. These are manifests you approved. This one from January 14th. This one from March 22nd. This one from July 9th. She tapped each paper. According to our investigation, none of these shipments actually occurred. The products listed were never moved. The trucks were never dispatched. The warehouse space was never used. Derek's face went from flushed to gray. That's impossible. I signed those because my supervisor verified. Your supervisor was facilitating fraud, Michelle said, her tone clinical and matter-of-fact. Meridian Financial was being billed for services that didn't happen. The inflated expenses allowed executives to hide embezzled funds and manipulate quarterly earnings reports. She pulled out another stack of papers. Your signature appears on 47 documents currently classified as evidence in a federal investigation. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek looked at me. I met his eyes without expression. Did you know about this? He asked. I'm the one who discovered it, I said quietly. He blinked. You knew? And you didn't tell me? Why would I tell you? The question came out sharper than I intended. So you could laugh at that too? Tell me I was being dramatic? Suggest I focus on learning to cook instead. Michelle cleared her throat gently, redirecting the conversation. Mr. Walker, I want to be clear. You're not currently a target of this investigation. If you were genuinely unaware of the fraud, if you were simply signing documents provided by your supervisor without independent verification, you may avoid prosecution. She let that sink in before continuing. However, your negligence made this fraud possible. We'll need your full cooperation. Statements, testimony, records of communications with your supervisor and Meridian executives. Derek slumped in his chair. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. Richard Brennan had been silent throughout this exchange, staring at his hands folded on the table. Now he finally spoke, his voice hoarse and strained. Emily. He looked up at me. Please. I waited. The FBI has enough evidence to prosecute. I know that. My attorneys have made that very clear. He swallowed hard. But your testimony will determine the severity of the charges. If you tell them this was systematic, deliberate, that we knew exactly what we were doing, we're looking at 25 years. He paused, his hands trembling. I have 3 kids in college. My wife had nothing to do with any of this. My parents are in their 80s. They depend on me. You should have thought about that before, I said. I know. I know. His voice cracked. I'm not asking you to lie. I would never ask that. I'm just asking, if there's any mercy you can show, any way you can frame this as mismanagement instead of. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward him. It was a pension fund report from 2019. 234 names listed in neat rows. Next to each name, a dollar amount showing what had been taken. Carol Simmons, I said, pointing to a name halfway down the list. She worked in accounts payable for 28 years. Retired in 2019. Her pension was reduced by 70% because you and your executives stole her retirement to cover your embezzlement. I scrolled down. Michael Patterson. Warehouse supervisor. 32 years. Thomas Chin. IT manager. 19 years. Sarah Jennings. Administrative assistant. 26 years. I closed the laptop and looked directly at Richard Brennan. You stole Carol's retirement to pay for your lake house. You took Sarah's money to cover your son's private school tuition. You want mercy? Tell that to Carol. Tell that to the 233 other people on this list who saved for decades and trusted their employer to protect them. Brennan's face crumpled. He put his head in his hands. Michelle Torres gathered her documents with practiced efficiency. The investigation goes public in 2 weeks. Arrests will follow immediately. Media coverage will be extensive. She looked at Derek. You'll need to retain your own attorney. We'll contact you within 48 hours to schedule your formal interview. She stood and Richard Brennan stood with her, moving like a man walking to his own execution. I remained seated. After they left, Derek and I sat in silence. The documents were still spread across the table. Evidence of fraud. Evidence of his negligence. Evidence of my months of secret investigation. How long have you known? He finally asked. 6 months. And you didn't tell me. No. Why not? I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man I'd spent 7 years trying to please. A man who dismissed my work, criticized my cooking, laughed when I lost my job. A man who never once asked what I was thinking, what I was feeling, what I was carrying. Because you never would have believed me, I said simply. The front door opened. Janet's voice called out, bright and chattering, something about her friend's grandson's wedding. She walked into the dining room still talking, then stopped when she saw our faces. What's wrong? She asked, her smile fading. Derek turned to his mother. His voice was flat, drained of emotion. How much money do you have in Meridian Financial stock? Janet's face went pale. The color drained so quickly I thought she might faint. What? She whispered. Your retirement portfolio, Derek said slowly. How much is invested in Meridian? She looked at me, then back at Derek, then down at the documents spread across the table. All of it, she said quietly. I stood, picked up my laptop and walked upstairs. I was done explaining myself to these people. I closed the bedroom door behind me and stood in the silence. Downstairs I could hear Derek's voice, low and tense, talking to his mother. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. Janet had just admitted her entire retirement was invested in Meridian Financial stock. Stock that would be worthless within 2 weeks. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop. Michelle Torres had sent an email an hour ago with the timeline. The investigation would go public on Tuesday morning. Arrests would follow immediately. I had 4 days. 4 days before everything I'd been building for 6 months became national news. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed listening to Derek pace downstairs until after midnight. Janet's crying came in waves through the guest room wall. Neither of them came to talk to me. Neither of them knocked on my door to ask questions or demand explanations. They already knew I wouldn't give them what they wanted. Tuesday morning arrived with gray skies and steady rain. I was in the kitchen making coffee when my phone started buzzing. Text messages. News alerts. My younger sister calling from Ohio. I ignored all of it and turned on the television. The headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Meridian Financial executives arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. The news anchor's voice was measured and professional. 6 executives arrested at dawn. Charges including fraud, embezzlement, falsifying financial documents. An investigation spanning 18 months. A whistleblower, unnamed, referred to only as a senior accountant who alerted federal authorities, had provided crucial evidence. My phone rang again. This time it was Michelle Torres. You're going to get calls, she said without preamble. Reporters mostly. Don't answer. Don't make statements. Everything goes through me until after the grand jury testimony. Understood. How are you holding up? I looked out the kitchen window. The rain was getting heavier. I'm fine. Emily. Her tone softened slightly. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. He was right. By noon, 3 news vans were parked on our street. Reporters knocked on the door. My neighbors figured out the connection within hours. Former Meridian Financial employee, husband works at Henderson Logistics, the same company implicated in the shipping fraud. Derek's phone didn't stop ringing. His supervisor called him in for a meeting. He left at 1 o'clock, his face pale, and didn't come back until after 5. When he walked in, he looked a decade older. His shoulders sagged. His tie was loosened. He stood in the entryway for a long moment before finally speaking. They suspended me, he said, pending their internal investigation. If they determine I was involved, even unknowingly, I'm terminated. I nodded from where I sat at the kitchen table. They said I might face civil liability. His voice cracked slightly. For negligence. You might, I agreed quietly. He stared at me. You knew this would happen. Yes. And you didn't warn me. No. Upstairs, Janet was still on the phone with her financial advisor. I could hear her voice, high and desperate, asking if there was anything that could be saved. The answer clearly was no. The reporter stayed for 3 days. Our neighbors talked to them. The story shifted angles. Whistleblower's husband worked for implicated company. Derek's LinkedIn profile was screenshot and shared across social media. His Facebook filled with comments from people he went to high school with, former coworkers, distant acquaintances. Everyone had an opinion about whether he knew, whether he should have known, whether he was complicit or simply stupid. He stopped leaving the house. 6 weeks later, I testified before a grand jury. Michelle Torres prepared me carefully. We spent days going over documents, practicing testimony, anticipating questions. She taught me how to remain composed under pressure, how to answer without embellishing, how to let the evidence speak for itself. The testimony lasted 3 days. I sat in a windowless room and walked 12 strangers through 6 months of investigation. I presented documents, falsified audit reports with Richard Brennan's signature, emails discussing creative accounting, bank statements showing offshore transfers. I explained transactions in plain language, connecting dots that seemed separate until you understood the pattern. On the second day, defense attorneys tried to shake me. They suggested I was exaggerating. They implied I was motivated by revenge after being laid off, that I'd manufactured evidence because I was bitter about losing my job. I remained calm. I presented my employment record. 12 years at Meridian Financial. Excellent performance reviews every year. 2 promotions. 3 awards for accuracy and diligence. I explained clearly and methodically that I'd orchestrated my own layoff to protect myself legally before the investigation went public. The defense attorneys had no response to that. On the third day, the grand jury indicted Richard Brennan and 4 other executives. Multiple counts. Fraud. Embezzlement. Falsifying financial documents. The prosecutor told me later that my testimony was the foundation of their entire case. When I left the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved toward me. I made one brief statement. 234 employees had their pensions stolen. I testified for them. Then I walked to my car and drove home. That night, Carol Simmons called me. She was crying again, but this time her voice was different. Lighter. Relieved. "They're freezing the company's assets," she said. "My attorney says we'll recover most of it. Not everything, but most." "I'm glad," I said and meant it. "Emily." Her voice caught. "Thank you. I know what this cost you." I thought about Derek suspended from his job. Janet, broke and bitter in Arizona. My marriage dissolving in slow motion. "It didn't cost me anything I wanted to keep," I said. Derek filed for divorce 8 weeks after my testimony. He framed it as mutual. Told friends we'd grown apart. Suggested the stress of the investigation had damaged our marriage beyond repair. I didn't correct him publicly. I hired an attorney and we divided our assets with cold efficiency. The house was sold. We split the proceeds. I kept my car, my retirement accounts, my personal belongings. He kept his car, his tools, his fishing equipment. There was no drama. No fighting over possessions. The marriage simply ended, dismantled as quickly as it had been built. Janet moved to Arizona to live with her sister. She never apologized. Not for the years of criticism, not for using me for investment tips, not for diminishing me at every opportunity. She just left. I watched them both go and felt only relief, like setting down weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Derek at a grocery store. He was with someone new. A woman younger than me who laughed too loud at something he said. He saw me in the produce section and looked away quickly, embarrassed. I realized I felt nothing. No anger. No hurt. No vindication. He was just a stranger now. Someone I used to know. A year after testifying, I rebuilt my career as a forensic accountant. Law firms hired me to examine financial records in civil cases. The FBI consulted with me on investigations. I traveled frequently, worked long hours that felt purposeful instead of draining. I was good at this work. Finding patterns in numbers. Seeing connections others missed. Following money trails that led to truth. 6 Meridian executives went to prison. Sentences ranged from 8 to 18 years. Richard Brennan got 15. His wife divorced him. His children changed their last name. Victims recovered 83 cents on every dollar stolen. Not perfect but substantial. Some of them sent letters thanking me. I kept those letters in a folder on my desk. On difficult days I read them to remember why it mattered. I bought a small condo near the city. 1 bedroom. Hardwood floors. Kitchen I actually enjoyed cooking in. I invited Carol Simmons for dinner one evening. We laughed about the terrible office coffee at Meridian, about Margaret Chen's rehearsed termination speeches, about how we'd both survived something we never should have had to face. Sitting across from her in my own space, eating food I'd cooked without criticism, I realized something. I was happy. Not the performative happiness I'd faked during my marriage. Not the careful smile I'd worn for 7 years while being made smaller every single day. Genuine contentment. I was never the problem. I was never too ambitious, too difficult, too much. I was simply surrounded by people determined to diminish me so they could feel bigger. Now I was surrounded by space. Room to grow. Room to breathe. Room to become whoever I wanted to be. My greatest strength was never cooking or pleasing others. It was seeing truth others refused to acknowledge and having the courage to expose it. And that strength didn't save me. I saved myself. If this story of justice and truth had you captivated from start to finish, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Emily closed that folder and calmly said, "Derek, you're home early," with the FBI sitting right there. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.